Everybody for joining us today. We're delighted to have you with us. This is the first of our 2021 Caribbean Council Live series of webinars, which we started back in March and look to be continuing for some time yet. For those of us who don't know us, we're the Caribbean Council. We're an organisation which is based in the UK. And which is set up to promote the private sector-led development of the Caribbean and Central America and to support increased trade and investment between Europe and the Caribbean and Central American region. And we've been focused on Central America as part of our operations since 2011. We're delighted today to be focused on El Salvador and to have two fantastic and knowledgeable speakers with us, and I'll introduce them shortly. El Salvador, like the rest of the year, has obviously had a fairly dramatic year with the joint challenges of a terrible health crisis, the economic impacts of that health crisis, and then the extra hit of the two hurricanes, storms, Eta and Iota, back in November. So it's been a difficult year, obviously, for El Salvador, and we're looking forward to hearing about how El Salvador's coped and some of the positives and negatives and what the outlook is looking forward. I understand there have been some positives, and the low oil price has kept fuel prices low. Remittances have been buoyant. And there's been a good agricultural year, so not all been negative, and certainly there's been some interesting developments in terms of new investments in energy, solar plans, and in the airport. So lots to celebrate, but obviously a tough economic climate more generally. So what I'll do is I'll first of all introduce our first speaker, who we're delighted to have with us. It's Johanna Hill, who's the founding partner of Central America Trade Consulting Group. Johanna's a trade expert with more than 20 years experience in international trade. She's a managing partner of Central America Trade Consulting Group in El Salvador, where she advises governments, private sector clients, and international organizations on issues relating to negotiation and implementation of international trade agreements. She served as a board member at Banco Azul de El Salvador and is currently the executive director for El Salvador's Telecommunications Chamber. She's also on the board of Vital Voices El Salvador and a member of Fusades. She served in government in various roles and was appointed by the President of El Salvador to serve as Vice Minister of Economy between 2007 and 2009. And she previously served as an advisor to the Trade Policy Department as a deputy director and then director of trade policy. Delighted to have you with us, Johanna. Thanks so much for joining us. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris and the Caribbean Council, for the opportunity of sharing with your members and audience a little bit of what's going on in El Salvador. I have a presentation today, so I'm going to share screen with you and the audience so we can get a better idea of what's going on. Let me see. Hold on. Just let me see if I can get a better view. There we go. So I wanted to divide the presentation today in three sections. First of all, how El Salvador has been responding to the COVID and how we're transitioning out of the worst part of the pandemic and the measures that the private sector and government have taken to address the crisis. And then concentrate the last part of the presentation on what are the trade and investment priorities of the government for this coming year and the following ones. So basically, in our case, in the pandemic, 2020, we could divide it in three phases. The lockdown, which started on March 21st, the first reopening of the economy, which came about around June 16th, 2020, and then the total opening of the economy from August 24th onwards. So when the pandemic, the first wave was hitting El Salvador, the government shut down the economy on March 21st. This included almost all production and commercial operations, except for the production of essential goods such as food, beverages, and medicine. Essential services were kept open, such as energy and telecommunications, and obviously commercial establishments such as supermarkets and pharmacies. All import and export operations were maintained. So I thought that that's very important to highlight that companies and the government maintained all import and export operations. Public transportation was closed, and our airport was also closed. Then on June 16, around 40% of the economy was opened up in the first phase of the opening plan. So the government, between the lockdown and the opening phase, worked with different sectors on developing biosafety protocols, so that when the economy started opening up, all establishments could take into account these safety measures that had to be implemented. Some of the first sectors to reopen were textiles and apparel, construction, BPOs and call centers that had not been open before, repair and maintenance services, courier services, e-commerce, amongst others. I think it's important to highlight that during this time, public transportation was not open. So factories had to provide private transportation with the appropriate safety protocols for those that wanted to come or had to come to work. Then there were some discussions between our Supreme Court, our Legislative Assembly, and the government on how the lockdown should be handled and the phases of the reopening of the economy. The executive branch and the legislative branch were not in agreement. And in the end, the Supreme Court ruled that the opening of the economy was to progress immediately, and that the two branches of government had to come to an agreement on how best to handle these lockdown procedures. And I think those discussions kept on going. And as of now, we have a total reopening of the economy. This includes public transportation, all retail, restaurants, tourisms. Only schools really have not reopened at this time. So how have we been able to transition during the COVID and afterwards, and what measures have been taken? According to a presentation given by FUSADES, which is a think tank, they measured that some of the sectors that have been most affected during the lockdown had to do with artistic and recreational activities, hotels and restaurants, construction, some parts of industry that had been closed off during the first phase of the lockdown, before the first phase of the opening, transportation and warehousing. I think it's important to take into account what measures of support were undertaken by our government during this time. One was the support and training that they gave to different sectors on how to implement the health and safety protocols to address the pandemic, especially for small and medium enterprises and public transportation. Also, the Ministry of Economy set up a one-stop shop for virtual training, some on health and safety protocols, but also encouraging firms to adopt more of an approach for e-commerce and digitalizing any of their process that they were able to. And also government support for the population that was mostly affected, that had to be with money transfers and food support, and some special loans for small and medium enterprises. For business, I would say that they are quite resilient and were able to adapt pretty quickly to the situation. Not in the same manner, obviously. Um, Smaller companies obviously had a harder time. Um, Many companies invested in implementing their health protocols. Some, like the textile and apparel, invested in being able to turn around and do operations for personal protective equipment, obviously for the local market, but also for export. We were able to supply some to the US market. Many positions were adapted to work from home if those positions allowed for it. I think one of the most important implications is that many businesses were able to be more speedily implementation of their digital strategies, and they were able to continue most import and export operations. I still think that the long-term effects or implications for businesses are still being felt. I think some companies are not going to be able to make it through the pandemic, and were not able to adapt, but we have seen that many have been able to do so. I think for an independent assessment of how El Salvador has handled the pandemic, I think we can go to the World Bank. And I took some images from the World Bank report on how they have evaluated our adaptation to our new reality. And I think one of the interesting facts that I found is that they consider El Salvador to be one of the most equal countries in Latin America and in the Caribbean, second only to Uruguay, but that might be affected from the effects of the pandemic. They recognize that El Salvador was the fastest country to take strong measures of containment due to the pandemic, and health wise has been one of the least affected in the region. Some of the measures that the government took to support households and businesses have to do with what I talked about: cash transfers to approximately 60% of all households, food distribution for low income households, payment deferrals for basic utilities, mortgages, and personal loans, extensions on income tax payments for individuals and some firms, lowering of bank reserve requirements for newly issued loans, amongst others, and also strengthening of the capacity of the public health system. Nevertheless, even though those strong measures have been taken, the economy has been hard hit by the pandemic. GDP is expected to contract by around 9% in 2020 due to the diminished economic activity of not only what has happened in El Salvador, but obviously the fall of demand internationally has also affected us, and also a reduction in remittances. The World Bank estimated a growth of 4.9% in 2021, but I think these estimates have gone down to 4% as of now. Yesterday was an important day for us. The government unveiled the trade and investment policy for 2020 going up to 2050, a 30-year trade and investment policy, the first one that has been drafted in the country that has a long-term measure or a long-term view. So I wanted to go through some of the most important parts, but I just wanted to give you an idea first of how we performed trade-wise last year as compared to 2019. As you can see, exports fell in 2019 around 15%, and we saw imports fall around 11%. So last year, our exports were around 5 billion and imports around 10 billion. Now, if we go down to analyze the trade relationship between El Salvador and the UK, we see that our main exports have to do with coffee, sugar, canned tuna, some apparel, especially jackets and socks, rum, processed beans, and agricultural tools. Our main imports have been from the UK, have been in iron and steel products, whiskey, obviously, pharmaceutical products, food preparations, some finishing agents like dye carriers for the textile and apparel sector, ink, sauces and preparations, and soap. So as I was telling you, yesterday the government unveiled their trade and investment policy for 2020-2050. And in this policy, the government indicated that some of the main objectives that they will be looking for in trade and investment is increasing the number of exporting companies, increasing the amount exported by regular exporters, and including more micro and small companies in the group of exporting companies. As a small economy, trade obviously is a huge vehicle for growth and inclusion. Some of the main action items that the policy determined are diversification of products and export destinations, definition of sectoral objectives to attract and retain foreign investments, the promotion of new trade agreements, but I think even more important is advancing and strengthening existing trade agreements, some issues relating to competitiveness, and the importance of investing in infrastructure and on improving our regulatory framework. I think in the last a couple of decades, I would say, we have seen that the Salvadorian regulatory framework has gotten quite complex. And I think there's a broad consensus on the need to cut red tape. A lot of the discussion is not on should we or should we not do it, but on how to do it, especially in areas like customs and opening of new businesses. Some of the priorities that the policy has indicated, some examples, are in promoting agribusiness, and a priority being advancing in the quality and implementing differential strategies in order to enter larger distribution chains abroad. In the case of industry, we have a solid industrial base, more focused on light manufacturing and finding a way on how to grow in the ladder of development. In the case of exports of chemical products, pharmaceutical products, plastics, and paper, we have a strong base, but it's mainly concentrated in Central America. And the government has indicated plans on finding ways to diversify target markets. And in the case of services exports, especially business services, professional services, and digital and computer services, they are mainly concentrated in North America and Central America, but have been expanding to Germany, Switzerland, and Russia. So that's reflecting the enormous expansion potential that this sector has in the expansion and industrial services in global value chains. And finally, I think it's worth talking about tourism. It's a very important sector for El Salvador, and we hope it's going to be bigger with projects such as Surf City, which helps to bring El Salvador into one of the main destinations as a surfing destination, and a new airport being planned in the western part of the country. Also, in the area of trade agreements, we are celebrating the recent entry into force of the association agreement between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Central America, which came about on January 1st of this year. Also, there is the importance of deepening and better taking advantage or using current trade agreements, such as the free trade agreement with the United States, where we have seen some of the quotas that are being underutilized. There are very favorable rules of origin in some sectors, such as footwear, that we could better take advantage of, and also the possibility to buy products to be processed later on in El Salvador from our other partners within the agreement, known as cumulation. We also would like to obviously make better use of the association agreement with the European Union. Most of the quotas are obviously being used, but they're not being filled. The ones that are most being used in the case of imports are the ones for powdered milk, cheese, and hams. We also have important trade agreements with Mexico, South Korea, the Dominican Republic, Panama, and Chile. And a lot of the focus will be in improving the Central American Customs Union. As you know, it is very much follows the European Union type of customs union. And we are now working on, obviously, the free movement of goods and other issues such as harmonization of sanitary standards. Some investment priorities that have been indicated by the policy have to do with the development of new sectors and industries and reaching new markets. Emphasis on the digital economy. The government has launched a national digital agenda, and Congress has adopted a series of legislations or is considering new ones in areas such as data privacy, e-commerce, cybersecurity, amongst others. The telecom sector is investing to expand and consolidate our 4G and LTE. And also the government has promoted the development of green energy. There are favorable incentives for renewables, and I think that the solar sector is the one that's been taking advantage the most. And also the government has plans for developing research and development centers for SMEs, especially in areas of pharmaceuticals, textiles and apparel, and I think plastics. Yeah. And finally, I wanted to close off with some important things that we should take into account when thinking about El Salvador. El Salvador is in the center of Central America, and we are very well positioned to reach markets in the Western Hemisphere, being at the center. Also, we have one of the biggest airlines, Avianca, in as one of their hubs is in El Salvador. So that makes a lot of trading and investment options very attractive for us because you can reach many markets in a couple of hours by plane. But also for e-commerce activities and for distribution activities, I think it's ideal. Business trips, and also for businesses that are focused on keeping low inventories, fast fashion. And when you combine those physical assets or aspects with other areas such as the international services laws that provides tax incentives to companies dedicated to activities such as maintenance or repair of airplanes and maritime vessels, logistics and international distribution and consolidation, research and development, international financial services, call centers, and BPOs. I think those can become quite attractive for UK businesses that want to take El Salvador as an important base for their operations, of consolidating maybe some of their imports and then redistributing to the rest of the Central American markets. So I think I've taken more than enough of your time, and I'll be open to any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johanna. That was absolutely fascinating, and you covered a lot of ground. But I think I certainly learned a lot, and I've got a lot of questions. But I'll come on to them when we have the Q&A and give Oscar a chance to give his presentation. Our next presenter is Oscar Samor, who's the partner of Consortium Legal. Oscar boasts more than 16 years of experience in banking and finance, mergers and acquisitions, and conflict resolution. He has extensive international experience and is frequently sought after for his experience in multi-jurisdictional transactions. He's a Fulbright scholar, and upon completion of his Master of Laws in Dispute Resolution from Pepperdine University, California, he worked as an international associate at King & Spalding in Washington. He's led some of the largest transactions to take place in the financial sector in El Salvador, including the acquisition of Banco Agrícola by Bancolombia and the acquisition of HSBC by Banco Davivienda. Oscar, it's great to have you with us, and please, over to you.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you. It's my pleasure being here and additionally sharing this panel with Johanna and the rest of the team at the Caribbean Group. Well, I'll be briefly. I don't know if Rachel, could you please help me with my presentation here? I do have a small presentation for you. I will discuss, some measures that were taken by the government, especially in the banking and financial sector, with regards of the pandemic, and to try to ease the problems that came with the crisis for the banks and many companies and individuals that were affected by this pandemic as well. So if we may please start, there you go. So in March 2020, when this pandemic started, and as Johanna mentioned earlier, there was a lockdown in El Salvador. The president's office issued a decree in which it was the suspension of all legal procedures, of the terms of all legal procedures and contracts were suspended. These included, of course, the contracts between the banks and its clients, which if we please go back to the previous one. Thank you. So then again, this included the banks and its clients, all loans, all credit agreements, insurance policies, etc. All the terms for the execution of these contracts were, of course, were suspended. So this meant, this meant that the central bank, which is the authority in charge of regulating all the financial activity in El Salvador, along with the superintendents of the financial system, they have the obligation and the faculty to actually supervise and regulate the operations of bank. They issued these temporary regulations that were aimed to support the financial clients of the financial systems that for some reason, due to this pandemic and the suspension of activities and the lockdown and other aspects involved in this pandemic, well, weren't in a position to comply with their obligations under the contracts that they had with the banks, either they were loan agreements, especially. So these measures were particularly aimed to, well, not reducing the risk ratings of any clients or customers of a bank that were in default for somehow. As you know, in El Salvador, we don't have credit score like we have in, like, there are in other jurisdictions. Here, banks follow certain policies and regulations that require minimum risk ratings for customers of the bank. Additionally, there was a no default status for all clients that were in compliant with their obligations, and there was no accrual of default interest or moratorium interest in case of default. If we can go to the next one, please. There were other regulations and procedures in place for this pandemic, by the central bank. Some of these are still effective to this day. And, there were mainly the reduction of the liquidity reserve for banks. So they would be able, there was more availability of funds in order to, grant what the regulation called productivity credits. These were credits aimed to promote, agriculture, industrial credits, and manufacture, construction, housing, commercial, and services in general. By having, a requirement, a lower requirement of liquidity reserves, World Bank had more opportunities to grant and more availability of funds to grant this type of credits. And the other one is a reduction as well in the liquidity reserve over deposits. And again, this increased the availability of funds for the banks to be able to make loans. And additionally, this was optional, of course, but they had more availability of funds to purchase notes issued by the government, and that were destined to obtain funds, and the proceeds of these funds were used to to somehow attend the pandemic that was in place in the crisis. If we can go to the next, please. Besides these regulations that the central bank issued, the government also issued a set of recommendations that weren't a law per se, but actually more, of a recommendation for some entities and banks to follow. The Association of Banks decided to voluntarily adopt some of these measures, which included freezing payments and collections, and for all loans and credits, and suspend any interest accruals for up to 3 months. And and they had to become creative and discuss the situation with their clients. And they were, as they were invited by the government to do so, but they still decided to make reductions in interest rates, um, change or extend the term for the loans. They granted grace periods for payments of capital interest. We've seen a lot of refinancing, consolidations, restructuring, deferrals of loans, of payments, etc. Right now, banks are in a situation where they've been, as it was expected, as an outcome of this pandemic and the lockdown, and the general crisis worldwide. Many companies are struggling to fulfill their obligations under their contracts and their credit agreements in general. So banks are recurring to these situations or to these measures in order to provide alternatives for their clients, and not and to some extent protect their own loan portfolio, and additionally not filling their balance sheet with assets garnished from their clients. Under Salvadoran law, there's a particular regulation for banks, which any assets that have been acquired by the banks due, for example, to the enforcement of any, a guarantee such as a mortgage or pledge, the bank has to remove these assets from their balance sheets in a maximum term of 2 years. So as you can imagine, if a bank, they enforce all their their collateral of the obligations that they have or the credits that they have with their clients, they would become a very big problem for them. So now we see the banks, like I said, getting creative and trying to find financial solutions for their clients. And lastly, with respect to the financial sector, there's been a law that is very relevant to facilitate the access to loans for lower amounts. Basically, what this law is trying to do is having the banks reduce the requirements that they usually have for their clients when they request a loan. So certain risk indicators that the banks use in order to determine whether a credit relationship with a client is viable or not. Right now, those under this law, the banks are in an opportunity to waive some of these requirements and actually grant credit to these individuals or companies. So this is especially for lower amounts. We've seen much more credit activity due to this particular piece of legislation. So if you can go to the next one, please. And what other key regulations are in place or the government issued to stabilize the economy and encourage business? Um, first, and I think Johanna mentioned some of this in her presentation, the government is aiming to modernize the way all procedures, administrative procedures, um, and other processes take place in El Salvador. They want to digitalize the economy, um, and by doing so, there are many pieces of legislation which I will discuss in brief with you that are aimed to achieve this purpose. But right now, for example, one of the most relevant ones, and that has become key considering the situation of this pandemic, is the issuance of technical regulations for the certification of the electronic signature. El Salvador had an electronic signature law in place for some time now, but there were some regulations for the application of this law that were still pending to be issued, and so it was very difficult to actually use efficiently or make use efficiently of this law. Right now, those regulations came into force in January this year, so we may expect more activity and more use of the electronic signature. As you can imagine, considering the great number of the great number of formalities and specific regulations for the execution of contracts under Salvadoran law, having an electronic signature law in place that can be used effectively can significantly reduce and incentivize economy and business in general. Additionally, there is, as Joanna mentioned as well, there's a free trade agreement between the UK and Central America, which came into force in January as well. This agreement is basically, it's called a continuity agreement, which basically emulates and incorporates the same provisions that were included in the previous agreement between the agreement that's still in place between, the EU and Central America. So most of these provisions are still a part of this free trade agreement, with some particularities, of course, regarding the particular relation between the UK and El Salvador or the Central American countries. There were special regulations for the international services law. This law provides tax incentives for companies and entities that are regulated under this law. However, these benefits are limited to the premises that have been authorized by the Ministry of Economy for the operations of these companies. So considering, for example, that now most of the work is still, even though the economy has reopened, most entities or many entities are still using, or working from home and having their employees working from home. So there were some special regulations that are in place right now and they are expected to actually continue after this pandemic ends, in order to allow companies that benefit from the international services law to continue having these benefits, even though most of their employees are working outside the premises. Another one that is very relevant is the creation of a trust to provide economic relief to Salvadoran companies that were affected by the pandemic. This is a $600 million trust that if a company has been, basically all companies that qualify for this stimulus, and they file the request, and if that request is approved, the government grants up to 2 months of their payroll, up to 50% of 2 months of payroll, and up to $45,000 per company. This, of course, is a great stimulus to companies that were operating during the pandemic and during lockdown. Additionally, this trust, some of the funds of this trust will be used for granting loans for the similar to productivity loans that I mentioned earlier, for companies that are affected by the pandemic, and another portion will be used for granting loans to the more informal companies, for more informal businesses that operate in El Salvador. And as you can imagine, it's a great part of our economy as well. We can go to the next, please. And what other regulations are expected to come in the next months or this year? Like I mentioned earlier, we'll have a new data privacy law coming. We had some data privacy regulations that were some kind of scattered, in other pieces of regulation. Now this new law tries to gather all of them in one single piece of legislation, and it's expected to cover many aspects that up to this date were not regulated in El Salvador. This, of course, will bring more security, and it's trying to incentivize every aspect of the use of technology for doing business. Additionally, in connection to the data privacy law, there's a new digital economy law, which intends to cover cybersecurity, electronic payments, data protections, and so forth. In the same area for the use of technology for business. There is an electronic securities law which is expected to come into force next year, which again, it tries to incentivize the use of electronic securities and promote business through a stock exchange in general. And there are many other regulations that are still projects being discussed in Congress that are aimed to modernize the government and to try to digitize the way that procedures that right now take a long time and that are difficult to complete because of many other steps when they do it, when they're done physically. So the purpose of the government right now is to have more expedite ways for doing business, and besides what is existing so far. So this is just a small glimpse of the regulations with regards to the pandemic and how the government expects to facilitate business and encourage business. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have on this end.
Thank you very much, Oscar. That was fantastic. And we'll now move on to the Q&A session. And do please, if you have a question for either Oscar or Johanna, please do put your questions in the chat box, and we will ask the questions as part of the discussion. We did have some questions submitted earlier, which we've also got. And you can also, if you haven't already, answer the poll question, 2 poll questions that we had. And the first of those was, which of the following areas do you think would most benefit from private sector innovation in El Salvador? And interestingly, by quite a large margin. The lead area was digitization and e-governance. Now, both of you spoke about the government's recognition that that's a priority and some of the steps they've already taken to adapt to the new situation and some of the legislation that they're looking at for the next few years. I'll be very interested in your comments on what's happening in the wider private market in digitization. Have you seen a widespread move to people adopting e-commerce and adopting new patterns of behavior? Because I understand in many other countries around the region, some of those trends which perhaps were already more advanced in other parts of the world have very quickly accelerated in the region. Would either of you like to comment on that?
Sure. Well, I have seen some initiatives, for example, from banks, now that we're discussing some of the financial sector and their, activities towards encouraging the business. Some banks have created electronic platforms for informal businesses to be able to access e-commerce. Some of them are promoting and creating, incentives for people acquiring products from local producers, and in addition, providing easy ways for payment in order to incentivize e-commerce, considering social distancing and all these concerns that most people have right now. So yeah, I do see some activity, and my opinion, and you see, for example, more businesses using applications for selling their products and delivery applications in general. So I do believe this is a trend that we will continue to see for the next years.
And as you know, Chris, in El Salvador, there's a widespread use of cell phones. It's some people have 2 cell phones to their name. It's incredible widespread use. Obviously, the use of smartphones has gone up. So I think that we are seeing the economy evolve towards a more digital economy. I think some things need to be done. I think that we need to, from the side of government, maybe provide a more robust framework, incentives even, in order to a more, how do you say, deployment of infrastructure, digital infrastructure. I think sometimes there's complexities at the local level, on deployment of infrastructure. And if we want to go into the digital economy, I think we do have to address some of the bottlenecks that we're finding. And also, I think that in the case of education, we see a lot of companies have been adopting, the digital world for their training, the bigger ones. But I do think that in the case of the public sector, public education, the government has been undertaking some initiatives so that students have access to more of education online. But that's still, I think, a long ways. We have a long way to go there yet.
Yes, I was interested that you said that that quite early on, I think in August, the economy had more or less been reopened, but the one thing that didn't reopen was the schools. And here in the UK, it's probably the opposite. The schools have been opened most of the time, and they were the last thing to shut. And that's been the priority here, for good or for bad. But it's a different approach. Okay. The other sort of question I wanted to ask before I come on to the other poll question was, Oscar, in your presentation, you talked a lot about the sort of early steps that the government took to put constraints on the banks about defaults and protecting people's livelihoods. I just wanted to understand, in terms of the cost of all of that, where does that end up accruing? Is it accruing effectively as public debt? And if so, I understand that there is a sort of general as in all countries, all countries have taken a massive hit in terms of seeing their debt increase. Is that a cause of concern in El Salvador, and is it going to continue to increase until the vaccine's there? And if so, when is the vaccine coming to El Salvador?
Well, I think I'll start with the last question, Chris. The government has mentioned that they have acquired vaccines, a number of vaccines for the population. However, we do not have a certainty on when the vaccination campaign will start and when people will start getting their vaccines. But that's something that we're still waiting. With regards to your other questions about banks and the increase of debt, I think we had, since the economy has reopened right now, all, debt is still accruing and interests are accruing. And as I mentioned, banks, this is a great concern for banks because there are many companies that are still struggling to try to survive this crisis, and they can no longer make payments and fulfill their obligations under their loan agreements. So banks are quite concerned about this matter, but they are taking a lot of creating measures and offering financial solutions for their clients in order to be able to help them. It's in the benefit of both sides of the industry. But yeah, that's still a concern. That's still a big concern.
Johanna, do you want to add anything?
I think it's well covered.
Fair enough. All right, well, before we come on to some of the other questions from the members of the audience, the second polling question was really a sort of where the most interest was in learning about. So it'd be great to hear your comments on the two sectors where there seemed to be the most interest, which was in services and BPO. So I guess that's contact centers as well as business processing offshoring. And manufacturing. Johanna, you talked a bit about both of those in your presentation, but it would be great if you could expand on that, and perhaps also be great to get your thoughts on. I've read in the press commentary that that there may be a increasing return of some of the offshore investments that went to Southeast Asia back to Central America for different reasons, for cost reasons, but also as a result of US tensions with China. And be great to get your sort of comments on those issues as well.
So yeah, in the case of services, as I mentioned, the one thing that I really like about the view that the government is taking on promoting trade and investment is that they hold industry as important as services. Sometimes in these type of documents, you see a lot of emphasis, especially from developing nations, on goods and not enough on services. And in our case, as you know, we are a small landmass with lack of natural resources, but a lot of people, and with a great work ethic. And we're very well known for our productivity and resilience. So I think that our long-term policy makes an emphasis on services as well as obviously on goods and industry. And we have laws that back up or promote those areas. So I think for your members, looking into these laws with a bit more detail could be important, because it promotes the development of BPOs and contact centers. We have a very well-developed call center sector. During the pandemic, I had asked somebody how they had overcome the pandemic, and it's great news that they lost no jobs. 80% are working from home, 20% are in the offices. So their personnel is very well protected. And I think if you couple it with what you were talking about, the nearshoring and how services is becoming such an important part of global value chains, then I think that we have something interesting happening in Central America in general and in El Salvador in particular, because of the way our legislation promotes the development of these centers. And in the case of industry, we have a very well-developed industrial sector, especially obviously in light manufacturing, paper products, plastics, food, textiles and apparel, pharmaceutical. Many of our light manufacturing goes to Central America to be processed into other products that are then exported. So I think one of our main focus should be on how to move up the development ladder, into more complex manufacturing, and also, how to also concentrate on products that are more diversified. I like the European approach to indicators, geographical indicators, GIs. And I think there are certain parallels to our region where we are, small markets, and I think our emphasis should be on products on the higher range, more sophisticated, and not on trying to compete with Asia on bulk.
Yeah. Oscar, did you want to add anything?
No, well, I totally agree with John. I'd say I would just add that we have legislation in place that it seems to incentivize this type of activities as well. So there's a lot of room for companies coming to El Salvador and and trying to set up their call centers or BPOs here. Um,
And also for the UK producers and exporters, I think that these type of legislation can help them bring their operations to El Salvador and then distribute to the rest of the Central American region. Because under the customs union, there is definitely facilities for their bringing their operations to our country and then distributing their products to the region. So it's services, but also the distribution of goods that are receive tax breaks.
And within the distribution of goods, within SIECA, how advanced is that now in terms of being able to distribute your goods within Central America? Tariff free, or it depends on the goods, I suppose.
It depends on the goods, but I understand that in the association agreement between the European Union and Central America, there were important provisions on the region to region aspects of the agreement, meaning that we would undertake stronger commitments to allow the free movement of goods, provide the harmonization of SPS or the recognition of SPS systems. So I think that's something that we could look at in the future. I haven't kept up with what's happening right now on these issues, but I think it's worth looking into, especially on, obviously goods from the UK that comply with the rule of origin. It's easier for them to receive the free movement of goods. But for those that had to pay the full tariff, can you get a break when you go on to the next country? Those are things that they were working on. But I have to confess that I'm not up to date on how well has it developed.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. One which is close to my own heart, as I'm busy trying to balance looking after two small children while working. Understanding schools are still closed, how quickly will the education sector start opening up? And what is the take up of EdTech, so online learning and people using online resources? Be great to get your comments on that. And then the second question is around, I suppose, crime levels, and has there been an increase in crime levels over the period of the pandemic, or has there been a decrease, or is it broadly stabilized, or what's the situation?
Well, I'd say with regards to schools, they're not open yet. However, the government, well, there was some discussions, in December last year, where the Ministry of Education was planning on reopening partially, schools. So students some students may choose to study physically and going physically to schools, and while other students could still do it from home. So that was a discussion. However, there's been an increase in the number of COVID cases in the last couple of weeks, especially probably due to the holidays. And so the Ministry of Education said that, that decision was going to be postponed for some time until you see a notable decrease in these infections. So that's not an option. With respect to tech ed, as far as I know, all schools are given are doing it using technology, even public schools. The government has made an investment in providing public schools with the technology necessary, with the instruments necessary for teachers to be able to give their classes online. So that's happening right now, and I'm assuming this is the way that it's going to continue to be for at least some time now. Yeah, and with regards to criminality, and of course, Johanna, please feel free to comment on anything or add on anything that I'm saying. But according at least to the numbers that the government is publishing, there's been a significant decrease in the criminality rates that they were in the last years.
Johanna, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, just on a part of education, the digital agenda that was launched by the government has an important section on bringing the education system online as much as possible. And I understand that during the pandemic, they have been experimenting with different partners abroad on using different technologies so that children can have access. But obviously, it's still in the beginning stages. I wouldn't say that the kids have gone fully online at all, but I do know that they're working in that direction.
Okay. One other question we've had is around pension reform. I think is there some discussion about potential pension reform in El Salvador?
Yes, yes, there has been some discussions around that topic. It actually comes and goes every now and then. Um, right now, pension funds are privately administrated, and they have a lot of liquidity. And there's little investments that are authorized for this pension funds to do. So there's been some conversations about reforming it, either making it or going back to a state administered pension fund system, or whether allowing access for the government to allowing the government to access these funds so it can feel either for budgetary purposes or other obligations. It's a very, if I may say, it's a very controversial aspect that the previous governments have had to face. But nothing right now. It's in black or white, and there isn't like a draft law or something similar at this point in time.
Johanna, do you want to add anything on that? Okay. Well, we're running up to time, so I'll just see if there was any other questions that people have put forward. I mean, I suppose the other question that comes to my mind, at least, is I think one of Biden's early acts of taking office was to talk about a $4 billion fund to help some of the countries in Central America to boost jobs and economic opportunities in the region. Do you see that as something? Well, I mean, I imagine you see it as something that's welcome, but where would you see those funds being channeled and directed, and what sort of sectors do you think will likely benefit from that?
Maybe I can start off. I think that with the U.S. government, the areas where they have emphasized working with El Salvador have to do in the economic area, if it is improving the business climate. I think that ensuring that everyone respects the rules of the game, improving the way we do business. From a legal standpoint, from security of investors, I think that's going to continue to be very important. Obviously, the other area where we've been working, and I think work still needs to be done, is in export promotion, developing new exporters, especially in the area of SMEs. Another area where I think it's important to keep on working, and we have done work before, is in trying to formalize more of the economy, bringing more people into the formal economy. And that also obviously helps not only create jobs, but it also, higher quality jobs with people that have more protections. I think also with the Biden administration, we can work on nearshoring opportunities that you touched upon earlier, Chris, and I didn't have a chance to really answer. I think that in part it's a policy-driven approach. Governments are trying to promote more nearshoring than anything else. But I think businesses have seen that with the pandemic and disruptions, not only from trade wars, but also from these, natural disasters or pandemics, that you need to have a more diversified sourcing base. And I think that's where we come in. So those that want to produce in the Americas for the Americas, I think that we are a good option. Even though we're small in size, we have great, productive capabilities. As many have seen, our apparel exports are huge in the U.S. So it just depends on the sector. Hopefully, we can, grow into other sectors. As we mentioned, we have trade agreements with lots of benefits that are not being used yet. So I think that it is a good moment where, things are happening in the marketplace, but I do believe that governments and businesses need to work together to make them happen in a bigger way and in faster. So hopefully with the Biden administration, we can work on those issues.
Fantastic. Well, Oscar, do you want to have any final comments on that?
I think Johanna covered pretty well.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. We've come to the end of our time. We've had a great discussion, and we had a good audience. And we will, if with your permission, we'll make your presentations available to the people who registered today. If there are other questions that people have for the panelists that we didn't get time to cover, we can do that by email afterwards. And just last remains for me to say thank you again to Oscar Samor of Consortium and Johanna Hill of Central America Trade Advisory. Have I said that correctly? I haven't, have I? Central America Trade Consulting Group. Thank you so much for your time today and for giving us so many insights. And we look forward to working together again in the future.